Well, we're continuing our summer worship series on the different foods in the Bible, and we're looking at ancient recipes that go back to Bible times, what they actually made and ate, and looking at the stories that talk about those biblical foods and how that can teach lessons to us today. And today we're going to talk about fish. In the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, it says this about Jesus. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses. For he has faced all the same testing we do, and yet did not sin. Jesus understands us. Do you speak fish? I don't. we have a definite no out there. And I don't mean do you speak to fish, but I mean how well do you understand fishermen? This is a true quote from a fisherman. When the willow's on the hook, the she-pigs like to come to the dance. What? Nothing better than drowning a willow cat on a drop shot over the wing dams to catch monster eyes. Now, before you think this guy was abusing kitties and hunting for the Loch Ness Monster, let me translate. A willow cat is a small relative of the catfish, and their fins they sting like wasps. They actually can make you go numb if you get stuck by one. And yet fishermen use them because they are phenomenal walleye bait. And so the fisherman that said that is saying that fish near the bottom by the many submerged dams along the Mississippi River, and you can catch big female walleyes. Not everyone speaks fluent fisherman, but Jesus does. Actually, he speaks whatever language you speak. He speaks mom. He speaks teenager. He speaks medical. He speaks farmer. He speaks English, he speaks Spanish, he speaks Hmong. Jesus speaks your language, whatever it might be. As the Super Bowl commercial said this last year, he gets us. He understands what we're going through, and he speaks in a language that we can understand. Like the fishermen that he called to be his disciples. Jesus didn't live next to the sea. He didn't own a boat. He didn't have a big tackle box. But when he speaks to them, he speaks in their language. And I don't mean their technical language. I mean the language of their life. So Jesus was a carpenter. He didn't live next to the Sea of Galilee or the Mediterranean. So you would expect when he's going to call somebody to follow him, he might say, "Follow me and I'll teach you how to build a church." Or he was such a great preacher. "Follow me and I'll teach you how to preach." But that's not what he says to the fishermen. He says, "Follow me and I will teach you to fish for people. I'll make you fishers of men." He speaks their language. He speaks fish. Now, the Bible has lots of stories about fish. I mean, we heard a week or so ago about the Israelites wanting to go back to slavery in Egypt so they could eat fish and vegetables. And we all know about the big fish that swallowed Jonah. And maybe you even remember the first plague in Egypt where God turned the Nile River into blood, and so all the fish died, floated to the top, and began to rot. There's lots of fish stories in the Bible because fish were so common. In fact, fish were more likely to be a meal of somebody in the Bible than steak or the kinds of things that we eat. In fact, for people in the Bible, you probably didn't eat meat but once or twice a year because that was for rich people. And unless you were rich or unless you had huge herds of cattle and goats and sheep, which meant you were rich, you didn't eat meat. You ate what was available, and that was often fish. So there's lots of stories of fish in the Bible. Now, the Jewish people of the Bible, they had certain restrictions on what they could eat. So when it comes to seafood, even if you live next to the Sea of Galilee or the Mediterranean Sea, you couldn't just eat all those wonderful things that I like to eat when I go to have a dinner out. I mean, there's no oysters, there's no shrimp, there's no crab. You couldn't have those things. No clams, oysters, all that stuff is forbidden. In Deuteronomy 14, God tells them, of all the creatures living in the water, you may eat any that has fins and scales. But anything that does not have fins and scales, you may not eat. For you, it is unclean. So, the Jews could only eat things in the water that have fins and scales, and that means fish. And not even all the fish. Because like catfish, they don't have scales. And so they can't eat those. I remember going to the Sea of Galilee, or going to the Jordan River, and seeing these great big catfish in there, and wondering why the banks weren't lined with people fishing for them. Then realizing, because you can't eat them, because they don't have scales. The Jews had those restrictions. Now, most of the fish that they ate was probably salted and dried. There wasn't any refrigeration. So it was either salted and dried, or maybe sometimes they ate it fresh. Unless you were a Roman. Then you ate fish one more way. And that way is garum. The Romans made garum, which is a kind of a fish sauce. And I thought we could make garum today, but then I reconsidered. You see, you're probably not really interested in finding how to make juice of fermented fish guts, which is what garum is. In the ancient book Geoponica, which roughly translates into agricultural things, they give a basic garum recipe. You put salted, small, whole, ungutted fish, like sardines, out in the sun. And then you stir it occasionally as it rots and ferments for the next month or so. Then when it's kind of liquefied and turned to mush, you strain it out, and the liquid that's left over is garum. And for the Romans, garum was like maybe soy sauce that some people might use, or in some Asian cooking, fish sauces, but it's their own particular brand of a fish sauce. I hear that you can actually buy it in stores, but I have never looked for it, and I never will. They say in Geoponica, it says that the very best garum is made from the blood, guts, and gills of tuna. And I did not try to find that on the internet and get it shipped here. We're going to do something different today. We're going to look at a fish. And the fish that we're going to look at, you know of as a tilapia. And this is the kind of fish that the disciples were probably catching out of the Sea of Galilee. All those stories, they were catching the Sea of Galilee tilapia. And usually they did it with big nets and would fish for them commercially that way. Nowadays, they're pretty much overfished, so most of the tilapia that you're going to get in a store or at a restaurant is going to be farm-raised. But back there in the time of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, that's what they were going after. And as I said, usually they use nets to catch them, but in one unusual story, we hear of Peter actually using a rod and line just like we might fish around here. And that story is in Matthew 17, and I want to share it with you today. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Well, yes, he does," he replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. What do you think, Simon? He asked. From whom do the kings of the earth collect duties and taxes? From their own children or from others? From others, Peter answered. Well, then the children are exempt, Jesus said to him. But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line, and take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my taxes and yours. Now, this is a strange little story, isn't it? I mean, it has nothing to do with cooking. But let's look at it closer. Peter is approached by the guys who are collecting the 2 drachma temple tax. Every male Jew over 20 years of age was assessed a 2 drachma tax for the upkeep of the temple, for God's house. But the guys who are collecting it wonder if Jesus has paid his taxes. See, there were some religious leaders at the time that were telling their followers not to pay the taxes, even though it was for the Lord's work. And these guys wonder if Jesus is one of those kinds of people. Peter says, no, Jesus pays his taxes. When Peter goes back inside the house, then Jesus asks him that question about the children of kings. Do they pay taxes to their father, or do other people? And he says, well, other people do. Then Jesus points out that the children are exempt. In other words, as the Son of God, there's no obligation for Jesus to pay his Father a tax. He could legitimately not pay his 2 drachma tax because he is the Son. But, he says, so as not to cause offense, Peter, go fishing. Cast the line, and the first fish you catch will have a coin in its mouth. Pay your taxes. So he does. Peter catches the fish so he can pay the taxes. And why does Jesus want him to pay the taxes? Not because he owes them, but so as not to cause offense. See, he knows us. He knows the way that we think. And what would the average person think if they heard that Jesus didn't pay his taxes to keep the temple up? I mean, it'd be like if you heard from me that I never gave anything to the church, that I kept it all for myself, and let everybody else give to God's work. You probably wouldn't spend much time listening to me. You go, he doesn't walk the walk. He talks, but he doesn't live it out. In the same way with Jesus, how is he going to convince these poor, struggling fishermen to follow him if he's not supporting the Lord's work in the same way that they're asked to? Because they know he can catch fish anytime he wants. They have to work at it. So as not to cause offense, Jesus says, Peter, go catch that fish, pay the tax. And he does. And you can imagine how Peter reacted when he actually brought in a fish with a coin in its mouth. Now, for today, we're going to pretend that we have that fish that Peter caught, his tilapia. And we don't live near the Sea of Galilee, and tilapia don't swim in our lakes and rivers, and so you're going to have to go buy a whole tilapia to make this recipe, which is not as hard as you think because you can get them at Walmart. I know you think that I am somehow a paid spokesperson for Walmart, but it's just amazing the stuff you can get there, including whole tilapia. Now, usually they come with the scales scraped off and the guts taken out, but if not, then you got to do it yourself. And these happen to be scaled and gutted, so it's very simple. We just pat them dry with a paper towel. And then, since we're going to grill them the way that Jesus would have done, we're going to just cut some slices right into them so that the spices can get through the skin. And They'll make them look all pretty too. And it's real simple. Just take olive oil and brush the outside and the inside with olive oil. And then put on any spice you like. I'm going to be using that Za'atar mix that we made a few weeks ago here in church. So you just rub that in, get it down in those cracks, and then all you have to do is throw it on a hot grill for 5 to 10 minutes aside, depending on how thick it is. And then you can serve it up, and it'll go from looking like this to looking like that. And you have to make your own French fries. They call this fish, if you go to the Sea of Galilee and you go to a restaurant, which I think that was from a restaurant there, they call it St. Peter's fish because it's what he caught, one of those tilapia. And imagine him who has been fishing all his life, probably caught thousands and thousands of fish, never ever finding money in one. And then Jesus says, first one you catch, you'll find the coin to pay our taxes. And he does. Now, Jesus could have come up with a temple tax another way. I mean, he had friends that supported his ministry, so he could have asked it from them. Or he probably knew where there were several lost coins. After all, he tells a parable about a lost coin being found. And yet Jesus sends Peter to fish. Jesus taught him a lesson on trusting in him in a way that a fisherman could appreciate. Jesus spoke through fish time and time again to those fishermen. We all remember how he taught the 5,000 to trust in him when he fed them bread and what? Fish. Took 2 fish and fed 5,000. But do you remember how he convinced the disciples that he was alive on Easter morning? On Easter, well, I don't know if it was morning then, Easter evening, Jesus shows up before the disciples. And they're not expecting to see him because he's alive. In fact, they're terrified. Let me share the story. It's in chapter 24 of Luke. While they were still talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and frightened, thinking that they saw a ghost. He said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts rise in your minds? Look at my hands and my feet. It's I myself. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you see I have." And when he said this, he showed them his hands and feet. He shows them his hands and feet, but they still aren't satisfied. And while they still did not believe, because of joy and amazement, he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence. Now, we might have been, if we saw nail holes in his hands, we'd say, "Okay, it's you, Jesus." But they haven't been reading the Bible all their lives with that story in it, because it hasn't happened yet. They are scared. They think it's a ghost. A ghost could have holes in its hands, I suppose. But Jesus says, "I'm going to prove to you that it's me, back in the flesh." And how does he do it? Fish. He takes a piece of fish and he eats it. It's a language they understood because Jesus understands them. A little while later, they're out fishing, and there's a person stands on the shoreline and says, "Have you caught anything?" They say, "No, we haven't caught anything." He says, "Cast your net over there." They do. They catch. Their nets are full. And they realize that they've seen this before. When Jesus called them to follow him, he did the same thing. They had a miraculous catch of fish, and now they have a miraculous catch of fish again. They haul it in. They realize it's Jesus. They're with him. And what does he do for them? He feeds them breakfast. And what does he serve for breakfast? Fish. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and he did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, this doesn't say whether he used any seasonings or not, but to these fishermen, he speaks fish. He knows them so well. But that's not his only language. To the farmers, he told parables about crops and harvests. To bakers, he speaks of bread and yeast. To shepherds, he told of the good shepherd. He understands us. There was the woman who had been bleeding for many, many years who came up behind him and touched the hem of his robe, believing and hoping that if she just touched his robe, that she'd be healed. And even though the crowd is pressing in around him, Jesus knows her need. And Jesus turns and she is healed. Jesus knows each one of us. He knows our language. He knows our life. He knows our needs. And he responds to it. To each one of us, he gets us. He speaks our language so we can know him and follow him. And so he says to fishing people today, "Follow me, and I'll teach you to fish for people." He says, "Follow me," to those who knit and crochet and make those wonderful prayer shawls. And I'll show you how to do that for people. "Follow me, and I'll show you how to sing for people," he says to the vocalists. "Follow me, and I'll show you how to cook for people," he says to those cooks among us. "Follow me, I'll show you how to raise kids for people. Follow me, and I'll show you how to bless people. Follow me." Whatever you do, whatever language you speak, Jesus knows you, and he calls you to follow him. Will he grill some tilapia for you on the lakeshore? Probably not. Besides, you have the recipe now, you can make your own. But he does invite you to walk with him, and he does feed you our daily bread and even the fish in a way that we can understand, because he understands us. He gets us. So let's pray. God, you know us so well. You know all of our weaknesses and our failures, our temptations and our struggles. You know all of our celebrations and all of our joys and all the things that we're really good at, whether it be fishing or otherwise. You understand us, you know us, and you love us, and you call us to follow you. So this week, Lord, help us to walk in your footsteps. And when others look at us, the way that we do our work, the way that we care for our families, the way even that we celebrate and relax, may they see a reflection of you in us. And may they know that you love them. And speak to them too in the language they understand. Amen. I invite you to rise and join with